Hello, everyone, and welcome to the book talk, Secrets of Global Governance. My name is Keren Yarhi-Milo. I am a professor of political science and international public affairs at Columbia and a director of the Saltzman Institute. And it is an honor to have today two colleagues, friends, who will be talking about a really great, terrific book that is coming out. We have Allison Carnegie, who really requires no introduction. Our colleague, Allison Carnegie, is an associate professor of political science and member of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace here at Columbia. Her research has been published in all major outlets, including a book that came out with Cambridge University Press in 2015 called Power Plays, How International Institutions Reshape Coercive Diplomacy. And her co-author for this book, for this project, is Austin Carson. Austin is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. He's also the author of many articles on secrecy and international security, as well as the author of Secret Wars, Covert Conflict in International Politics, that came out with Princeton University Press in 2018. And today they will be talking about their book, Disclosure Dilemmas and the Challenge of International Cooperation. As I said, this is a book that is coming out or came out recently with Cambridge University Press. And we are very honored and thrilled to have them both with us today to talk about the book and to have an opportunity to ask them questions about the research, the process, the findings, and the implications all of these have for international politics, for the literature, for understanding the world today. So thank you for coming and being with us. The way we're going to set it up is we're going to start with Austin and Allison talking for about 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes even, about the book. They will share the main argument and findings, and then I will ask a few questions and we'll quickly open it up for Q&A from the audience. I guess this, yes, I can admit this. So without further ado, Allison, Austin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to Keren for moderating and hosting this event, and to Ingrid for helping to set everything up, and to the Saltzman Institute as well. We really appreciate it. All right, so we have some slides. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So as Keren said, this book is called Secrets in Global Governance, Disclosure Dilemmas and the Challenge of International Cooperation. So this book was really motivated by a few puzzles that Austin and I noticed. So here are a couple of examples of what I mean. So in 1998, Brazil accused Canada of subsidizing its aircraft industry. Canada actually had information that could exonerate it, but held this information back. And then in the 1980s, the United States had information about North Korea's nuclear program, and that information could help to facilitate a multilateral response, but the US chose not to share it. And so Austin and I were really wondering why. Why would the US or Canada not share information that could actually help it? And what we concluded was that, and what we talk about in this book, is that there were dangers associated with exposing sensitive information. And so we really know little about the possible role for intelligence or sensitive firm details in global governance, but Austin and I argue that this kind of information has become critical to understanding the problems that international organizations can solve, and also how they can solve them. And so that's what we explore in this book. And so the problem, in a nutshell, is that states and firms often have some sort of unique insight about compliance or non-compliance with international laws and norms that they either glean from their, say, sophisticated intelligence bureaucracy, or that firms know about themselves. But these actors are often reluctant to make their information public or to share it because it can cause harmful adaptations. So what we mean by that is if you reveal intelligence information, it can jeopardize your national security by revealing the sources and methods you use to collect it. Or if you share sensitive firm details, it can jeopardize your market share as other firms learn pricing and cost information and can better compete with you. And you can't just share the conclusions because that's not credible, because states and firms have ulterior motivations for sharing conclusions that are convenient for them, right? So maybe you want to protect allies, for example, or harm your adversaries. And so a solution that Austin and I propose in this book is that international organizations can develop confidentiality systems, which are systems to protect this kind of information, so that states and firms can share the information with the IO. The IO can vet it with using, technocrats, experts, and then protect the sensitive details and just disseminate the conclusions of the information, which are then credible because other actors know it's been vetted by the IO, which doesn't have the same political motivation. And so as a result, sensitive information we think should be disclosed more frequently, and that information should then improve cooperation because it helps the IO to work better. But this story is not all good news. We're not claiming that IOs are some kind of cure-all. There are downsides to this as well. So we're arguing too that information is a source of power for actors. So actors can reveal it based on their own self-interest. They can choose when to provide the information and when to hold it back. And then also, doing this requires IOs to develop a confidentiality system, which requires secrecy. And that flies in the face of the norms of transparency that we've seen. And so that's another potential downside associated with our argument. So what do we find empirically? So we find that when IOs have better confidentiality systems in practice, states and firms do disclose more sensitive information to them. And actually, as we'll talk about a little bit, Austin and I were really surprised by how much information states and firms were willing to disclose. They weigh the costs and the benefits, and the more the IO can keep the information confidential, the more they'll share. And then that sharing does improve IO effectiveness and cooperative goals, as we'll talk about a bit. But as I mentioned, this sharing is often conditioned by political relationships. You might want to help allies harm adversaries. But we find that this pattern holds across domains: security, economics, human rights. And we use a multi-method approach here. So we use new data. We have a variety of new data in this project. We coded 106 IOs for their confidentiality systems. We also have new data on redaction patterns and other measures of sensitive information that we glean from WTO reports and other documents. And then another way that we measure sensitive information is using interviews and archival documents that detail US intelligence sharing with the IAEA and also the ICTY and the ICTR. And so what? So one of the big questions we're addressing here is, how do IOs facilitate cooperation? Now, the literature, starting back with Cohen in 1984, says that information is key. And so a key function of IOs is to disseminate information, and that can help states know who's violating or cooperating with the law, right? But we're saying, actually, if information is sensitive, then doing this function that the literature claims is so essential can actually be counterproductive. It can make states share less information with the IO. And in those cases, IOs can actually help through secrecy rather than transparency. And so this is just a little graphic to show you what we mean kind of in a picture. So in the sort of classic conventional wisdom account, which is the top picture, information comes to the IO, and the IO simply disseminates it among states, NGOs, and publics. But in our account, there are two types of information. So we're disaggregating information into sensitive information and non-sensitive information. So non-sensitive information follows the standard account still. It passes right through the IO, goes to states, NGOs, and the public. But the sensitive information actually is stored securely within the IO and is not shared with these other actors. So intelligence and firm-specific information. So I mentioned the first contribution already. Another contribution of our book, we think, is is that it contributes to the literature on barriers to interstate cooperation. So there, the literature highlights this core problem of uncertainty, which relates to information under provision. And here we're putting forward a new reason for this under provision, which are these adaptation costs that other actors will adapt to the sensitive information in a way that will harm the disclosure. And then we also argue that we're contributing to the sources of power in international relations and in IOs. So scholars have theorized a variety of sources of power, but an under-theorized mechanism here is information provision, and that's what we're talking about in this book. So just to talk a little bit more about the relationship between sensitive information and compliance. So in the literature, timely, accurate information about compliance is what enables actors to punish states. And I realized I just went past the slide where I was going to turn it over to Austin. So Austin, why don't you jump in here?
You were doing great. I was fine with that. Yeah, so first of all, hi everyone from Chicago. It's great to be there with you to talk about a book that we're really excited to have out in the wild now. And as Allison was saying, sort of the starting point of the book, why we even want to talk about the sensitive information stuff in the first place, is that it's very difficult to identify instances of non-compliance and separate them from what might be compliance. That timely, accurate information that's necessary to punish, hold accountable those who violate norms and international laws, it's not easy to come by. Partly that's because the actors who are doing those violations will hide their transgressions. Part of it is that alternative sources of information other than those actors is often low quality. And so what we're focusing on is the sensitive information that provides oftentimes really unique insights. So it might provide an overhead imagery of a site that's otherwise unobtainable, or firm documentation that can show you just how much someone's bottom line was harmed by a trade barrier erected by a foreign government. But the point with the sensitive information, what makes it sensitive, is that public circulation of that knowledge has some sort of damaging effect on the actor that holds that information. And so if you want to advance a little bit, Allison, so the basic trade-off this ends up creating is a trade-off between disclosure, which can help clarify compliance, might be in your interest to either exonerate yourself or show that another country that you'd like to show is in violation, to show that they are in violation, in fact. A trade-off between that incentive to disclose and the incentive to withhold that information, which can avoid the damage that you get if that information is widely circulated. Next slide, please. So we introduced 4 key terms in our theoretical framework to create a sort of systematic way of thinking about the phenomenon and the trade-offs that we think are really interesting and create this disclosure dilemma. The benefits that we mentioned already about clarifying compliance issues with insights that are derived from sensitive information, we call incrimination benefits. And then the damage that you as a firm or a government will suffer if that information is widely circulated. It might be commercial damage, it might be security damage if you're unable to collect intelligence in the same way you could before. We refer to those collectively as adaptation costs. And when you are in situations in which the information you have both has incrimination benefits and adaptation costs, we call those disclosure dilemma situations, or disclosure dilemmas, that have a mix of incentives and disincentives. The fourth main concept that we develop is a reaction or a solution to this problem, as Allison framed earlier, the problem and the solution component. And that's confidentiality systems. That's what we mean by secrecy in global governance in the title. These are really basically organizational techniques that you might see at a high-profile private firm or in a state in their national security organization or bureaucracy. These are techniques for limiting access to sensitive information, locks and key systems, redactions and ways of classifying documents, encryption techniques to store information, even personnel rules like, hey, if you disclose this and you're not supposed to, you're going to get fired. These are all ways that complex organizations keep secrets. And what we are looking at, in essence, in this book, is the increasing prevalence of these features in international organizations to help them use the sensitive information. And of course, all of these techniques for keeping information within an organization help mitigate what we call adaptation costs from that information if it were to get out more broadly. The other thing that a confidentiality system is paired with is the ability of the international organization to evaluate those disclosures. So this isn't a story about how firms or governments just give sensitive information to an IO. The IO just nods and says, oh, that looks fine by us, and passes it along to the conclusions based on it, passes those along to other governments or something. We really highlight in the book the way that the international organization has to evaluate the conclusions and pair the sensitive disclosures with other information and facts they can gain on their own. And the result, of course, is a clearer picture about compliance. So there's two ways to think about this. If we could go to the next slide, Allison. The two ways to think about this, one is from the perspective of the actor, the firm or the state that has this information. What are the sort of incentives and disincentives they're looking at? So looking at sort of a game, sort of extensive form game theoretic type of setup, this is what we have here in this graphic. The first question that we think that they're asking themselves is there an incrimination benefit? Is there an incentive to share this information that I have? If not, then the natural response is to keep it private. If there is an incrimination benefit, then we move on to the next sort of decision factor. And that is there any cost to disclosing that information, to trying to show that the compliance or non-compliance is out there in the world? Is there some kind of downside to providing that information? If there isn't, then you can just share that information publicly. But if there is an adaptation cost, then you're in that situation of a disclosure dilemma. And of course, the final thing that we think states and firms are thinking about is there an international organization to whom I can disclose that information and they'll protect that information and keep it confidential? If there isn't, then we think the natural reaction is to usually keep that information private. And if there is one, then the idea is that you can disclose that information directly to the international organization. So if we go to the next slide, actually there should be one more in between these. Is there one more between these or do we not have that? Allison. Oops. Just go back a couple. One more. Oh, we don't have it. Okay. So the two core hypotheses that we derive and look at in a set of 4 empirical chapters are about, number one, disclosure patterns, and number two, the degree to which cooperation is being furthered by the international organization, how much cooperation is actually happening. And so in general, we argue and look at a series of adaptations or applications where we assess whether or not IO confidentiality systems, once they're created, do they increase the degree to which this kind of sensitive information is disclosed? And we specifically predict, because we think governments especially are thinking about these incrimination benefits, not just in terms of whether there's more or less compliance, but also who is complying or not complying, that is their geopolitical relationships, that sensitive disclosure pattern should be affected by whether or not the information is about an ally or, say, a rival, okay? So that's our first hypothesis about disclosure. The second hypothesis is then, if more sensitive information is flowing into international organizations, if they're getting what we think is more unique insights about the degree to which compliance or non-compliance is happening, should we therefore expect that more cooperation should be happening, more effective monitoring of compliance should take place. And so the example would be a new confidentiality systems introduced at the IAEA, let's say, to the organization that monitors and inspects nuclear nonproliferation. That should lead to more disclosures of national intelligence or sensitive information, especially regarding non-allies from the perspective of the disclosing state. And it should improve the degree to which the IAEA can suss out instances of suspicious nuclear activity. So we look at these two core hypotheses in 4 empirical areas that span security and economic domains. The security ones, nuclear proliferation and war crimes, have to do with intelligence, where the adaptation cost is these sources and methods, and the incrimination benefit is trying to essentially get non-allies held accountable for their activities that are in violation of laws, or whether they're war crimes or non-proliferation rules. The relevant IOs are different, of course, but the ultimate outcome we're interested in is the degree to which, if this information does arrive in a higher frequency after confidentiality systems are built into the IO, does that lead to more suspicious facilities being identified and closed, or in the case of war crimes, more arrests and indictments of high-level leaders who can't be held accountable unless intelligence that connects them to a war crime is available. In the economics domain, we look at trade and investment. And here, the relevant adaptation cost, that is the downside to public circulation of information, is commercial damage or market share for the firms who are disclosing the information. And the benefit is, of course, trying to adjudicate trade and investment disputes more effectively, and possibly for a state, helping its case within a particular dispute. We look at the World Trade Organization and ICSID, which are two central IOs for those two areas, and we really ultimately trace it to outcomes like the degree to which trade or FDI flows are increased or decreased by whether or not this kind of information is being fed into the dispute process. The prediction being that it would be higher to the extent that the WTO and ICSID could use this kind of information. So to conclude, what we're trying to do in this book is theorize what we think is a somewhat unique cooperation problem, disclosure dilemmas that are a function of the unique properties of sensitive information, and talk about and develop a unique function for IOs. It clearly builds on and is related to a Kohanian story about the importance of IOs for helping cooperation, the role of information in addressing cooperation, but it's, we think, a different story about how that actually works. And as Allison described, we tried to gather new data, conducted original archival work. We did elite interviews in Vienna and Geneva, DC, to try to talk to people who are involved in these processes to understand how they work and to collect data on patterns of disclosure and things like that. And of course, the caveats that we have throughout the book is that these disclosures are influenced by geopolitics. So it's not just everybody's happier and better off when this process is allowed to unfold. It's shaped by who has information and what their interests are. And of course, secrecy in global governance is an awkward fit. And so that's a sort of normative tension that's a byproduct of this function. And one of the things that we're really excited about is the degree to which we ended up finding out that this is a phenomenon that applies and is relevant across a number of domains. The ones we look at that I've already mentioned, but we also look at extensions in the book, as well as work that we're sort of working on right now that extend it to the area of disease spread, to finance, to the environment, to peacekeeping, to cyberspace, trying to bridge domains in this book that are typically analyzed separately and hopefully set up future research on the consequences, the reasons these confidentiality reforms are introduced, and how this plays out in other issue areas as well. So we're looking forward to hearing questions and comments, and really appreciate you coming to listen.
Thank you so much for outlining the contributions of the book. So I'll start with two questions. The first question is about thinking about the international organizations and actors and the process by which they understand and they get to this realization that they need to have better system in place to allow states to share sensitive information. Can you speak to this process of how organizations come about to understanding that they need to reform, and how does it look like across the different domains that you are studying here?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Keren. What Austin and I found is that oftentimes, even when these reforms are needed, they won't be implemented for a while because of things like status quo bias, right? We all know from the American politics literature and also international relations how sticky institutions are. And so a lot of times what we found is it will take some sort of event or frustration of the institution to get the political momentum for reform. So for example, at the WTO, we saw that there was the Boeing Airbus case, which was this huge high profile event that involved national security also because there were governments involved in aircraft. And before that, it was hard to get the secrecy needed. But after this sort of high profile case, that was when the IO was able to implement some of these reforms. Similarly, in the case of the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, it was really only when the tribunal could not get access to the evidence it needed to prosecute crimes, and it was basically failing. At that point is only when it was able to overcome sort of all the qualms that states had about enabling it with the secrecy function.
And just to embellish and add to that, I think one of the things that we also see is that states who have a vested interest in the success of these institutions can themselves help put this idea on the agenda and help advocate for it. So in the nuclear nonproliferation domain, what you saw was the United States was far from reluctant to have this function added to the IAEA, especially after the first Iraq War exposed the degree to which Saddam Hussein at the time had successfully hid a lot of his most nefarious nuclear research activities. So the US basically comes to the IAEA and says, hey, you need to figure out a way to integrate insights from our intelligence services and from other states if you're going to be able to find undeclared nuclear activity. And so, it depends on the government, right? Like they're generally reluctant to give this kind of power to an international organization. But if your interest is in making that cooperation actually more effective, that make that IO able to make international rules bite, then you can end up finding governments that are in the driver's seat propelling that discussion.
Terrific. My next question has to do with the role of trust. What trust states trusting an institution to begin with, or even trusting an institution after you have this confidentiality mechanism at place? What role does trust play here in your story?
No, that's great. I mean, I think trust plays a huge role because you're right, states do need to trust the IO to be able to securely handle their information and in a pretty, unbiased manner, or at least a manner that won't go against their interests, right? So there are certain things IOs can do, I think, to try to foster that kind of trust. And again, we're not claiming that all IOs that have these kind of functions are inherently trustworthy or something. It's the more trustworthy they are, the more sensitive information can be shared with them typically. But things they can do are staff technocratic people rather than say political operatives in key positions. They can, a lot of times they'll have some sort of history of secret keeping to show that they've got a track record of doing this. So if they've got a track record of leaks, that's a huge hurdle to overcome in the future. And we might even see they need to sort of splinter off from their leaky former self, kind of a new branch or something, if that's the case. They need to be careful what countries they choose to staff their staff to come from. And sort of, yeah, I think exactly what you're saying. They just need to show that they're relatively neutral, unbiased actors.
So yeah, to add to that, I mean, this was one of the things we were really curious to find out in the research process, Keren, was, how does this work? Like when you approach this topic, it's like, why would a state trust intelligence to any international organization? They got to be leaky as a sieve. And so that's one of the fun things that we had the opportunity to do, was to talk to practitioners about, okay, how did you actually, we would ask nitty-gritty questions like, how do you go through the approval process to get intelligence released from your intelligence services and shared with that international organization? And so they would sort of walk it through and they'd say, this is what we would look for. These are the kinds of institutions we would be willing to do it with or not, and the reasons why. But I think to pick up on another thread, Keren, in your question, there's actually two levels of trust going on here. There's trust in the protection of information if you're disclosing it. But then there's trust if you're the other states who can't see that information, but you're supposed to act politically based on conclusions that are derived from that information. And so, as Allison was sort of foreshadowing at the end of her answer there also needs to be a trust in the ability of the IO to vet this information, to reach judgments based on, in part, information that everyone can see, but in part, information they can't see. And that level of trust is equally important to make this whole process work as we described, sort of the ideal function.
Thank you. So before I turn it over to the audience to ask questions, I want to ask you, there's a lot in this book, by the way. This is a fascinating book, such clear, parsimonious theory, amazing data collection effort, new data, and you are really speaking to so many issues, from nuclear proliferation to WTO, trade dispute, war crimes. It's really incredible and very unique and so powerful. So with that, I want to give you an opportunity, invitation to talk about the implications of your study to some of what we're seeing happening in the world today with international organizations. You talked about, for example, the World Health Organization and the pandemic. So just an invitation to speak about the implications, the policy relevance of this, and the implications to what is happening these days with the credibility of international organizations that's on the line.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think the pandemic has really highlighted some of the themes that we discuss in this book. So you're right, we alluded to the World Health Organization. So there, in the setting of disease, what you might think about in terms of sensitive information is things like the extent to which your country is experiencing an epidemic, right? So that can help you might be interested in that because that can help with cooperation, that can help other countries to plan their own response to their epidemic, that can help them plan, trade and travel and all that. But on the downside is, if I tell you that we have a huge epidemic in the United States and you're in another country, you might implement some sort of travel restrictions or trade restrictions, or, it might negatively impact my economy. So there are big reasons not to want to do that. So that information is very sensitive in that context as well. And so Austin and I do think that actually the WHO, there's room there for a much more robust confidentiality system. So we talked with some experts in that issue area recently and learned that there's almost no confidentiality there. And so, yeah, we actually wrote a piece recently about specific ideas about how to make the confidentiality system more robust. And then thinking about the UN a bit as well, one of the ways the pandemic, I think, has really impacted peacekeeping, for example, is peacekeepers are less able to be on the ground because of worries that they'll transmit the coronavirus or become infected. And so it's harder for them to get information on the ground. And so one thing Austin and I were advocating was a greater use of intelligence information. But that, in that context, that's also hard because the UN has been leaky in the past and you need to overcome some of these issues that we discuss in the book. But I think those are both really fascinating areas that both deal with the current pandemic and sort of deal with the issues that we discuss.
Yeah, and to add to that, Keren, I think, there's a lot of policy relevance directions we could go. And I think thinking about it from the perspective of an individual government, say a Biden administration, if that ever comes to pass, is one we should definitely return to in the Q&A. But to stick to the sort of credibility of IO's line of questioning, I think one of the interesting things we found was that in the historical evolution of these institutions, oftentimes the credibility crisis moment for an institution is when the confidentiality system is introduced. And you can actually see that with the World Health Organization in spades. Everybody is looking at ways to try to reform the institution because there's a widespread view that it was unable to investigate and assess COVID-19's initial transmission and outbreak within China. And so one of the proposals that's being considered is equipping it with some of the powers the IAEA has, some of which are not about sensitive information disclosure. They're about being able to go into member states and assess a situation with less of a requirement of the permission of that government, and more on the model of being able, if all the member governments approve it, to be able to do it without that permission or with less permission. The other is to receive and be able to use sensitive information. If the US intelligence community is tracking disease outbreaks as a matter of national security, that information could help inform the World Health Organization in situations where the host government, who's the host of the pandemic, is reluctant to come forward. So it's another example where this sort of information gaps can be filled by this kind of information. And if anything, the credibility problems IOs might be facing in today's world might be partly remedied by this kind of reform.
Great, terrific. Thank you so much. So now I would like to turn it over to our audience, and if you don't mind, use the hand raise button, and I will try to see it. But Ray, you can also feel free to monitor that. So I have the first one. Wait, somebody just raised his hand. Okay. Daniel, can you unmute yourself?
I am unmuted. Thanks, Keren. Thanks, Austin. Thanks, Allison, for the great talk. I was 5 minutes late. I'm the director for UN studies here at CEPA, and I moderate another event, so I came in 5 minutes after the start of the presentation. It sounds like an amazing book. I look forward to reading it. I have not done it yet. I have a question about, which is similar to Keren's last question about transferability. And so to what extent does a structure of IOs have an importance for that? Because the majority of the national organizations do not have mechanisms in bite, right? The majority of agencies, programs, and funds don't have a mechanism to actually go in and report and coerce or enforce. So the question is, in the broader scheme of how international organizations influence state behaviors through agenda setting or convincing, or to some extent then these human rights mechanisms, other mechanisms. So what does the structure of the IO have to do with how states reveal information or use IOs in order to achieve their goals through revealing information? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So thinking, just to make sure I understand it, thinking about how once the IO gets the sensitive information, how does that help it actually enforce international laws and norms, given that many IOs don't actually have, enforcement powers? Is that's how I understood the question?
That's a part of it, but as I understand you, one of the key things that you're looking at is how states access international organizations and reveal information. So one question would then be, how is the states' ideas about the enforcement character of an IO influencing their decision to share information? From a rational choice perspective, I would say, well, if there's any cost involved somehow politically, I only shared where they actually have a stick in the hand. If they only work without a stick, then so is that the case or not?
Right. So I would say it does vary by the institution, but often even reputational consequences can be effective. So if you think about in international trade, for example, a lot of scholars have argued that reputation plays a huge role. If you know which countries are violating their trade agreements, then you won't want to sign a trade agreement with them in the future. And so, even if it's not, a stick per se, there can be sort of softer consequences that are still, I think, can be worth it for states to share the information. So I guess I would say it depends on a state's particular goals and how enforcement works within that particular IO, which I think varies a lot across international organizations. Austin, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would sort of agree with that and embellish in the following way. I mean, I think, Daniel, I think it's a great question, and thank you for asking it. I think on the one hand, I would say that the more instruments besides confidentiality that your IO has, the more useful providing sensitive information is going to be to it. So adding the ability to do spot inspections is going to increase the value to a state of providing that IO with that kind of information. But having said that, part of the reason we anchor and frame the book around this Cohen story is that Cohen and all the literature from that era's starting point is these institutions do not have a coercive function, that they work by providing information to allow decentralized punishment, as Allison was saying, based on reputation, based on tit for tat retaliation, that kind of thing. And so, but what the critical ingredient to that decentralized enforcement is high quality information that's convincing to state and non-state actors who can exact those costs. And that's why I think this was so interesting to learn about, was the degree to which providing these confidentiality assurances to these actors can actually give the IO the fuel for it to really provide the kind of informational judgments that then actors go and take and impose consequences.
Thank you. Next, we have Nancy Collins.
Thank you, Keren. Thank you so much, Allison and Austin, for the presentation, and even more for this terrific book. I have two questions. The first is, I wonder if you could detail a bit of the intellectual conceptualizations of the book. So well before it became a book, well before the interviews and the data sets, why you went down this pathway, and then how some of the questions that you selected came to the fore, and maybe even some of the questions that fell away that you found became less relevant as you delved deeper into your research. My second question, I guess, is on the other chronological end of that spectrum, which is now that we have this terrific book, could you give us a sense of where you see some avenues and pathways for future work to build on it, and what you might do, but also what you hope that all of us listening may do with it going forward? Thank you so much to you both.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. Yeah, those are fun questions. So how it was conceptualized. So actually, Austin and I started our careers basically by doing a postdoc the same year at Princeton at the Niehaus Center. So our offices were right next to each other, and so we were always kind of bouncing ideas off each other. And so this actually started as kind of just thinking about information sharing in global governance, generally speaking, and article form, actually. And so we actually had a separate article on kind of a different topic, but related, and that led to us to continue to think about information sharing generally. And we started, it started as this article, and then when we were presenting the article, one of the some of the feedback that we got consistently was, well, hey, doesn't this travel to a number of different domains? Why are you only focused on nuclear? You should examine this in other settings. And so we kind of built out the theory from that article to be more generalizable and started thinking more broadly. So it started a little more narrow and then kind of got bigger. But it was a long but very fun, I think, process for me anyway. And so so thinking more about more of the details and how things fit together along the way, we were always having these aha moments. It was a really organic process. Austin, did you want to jump in for the future work?
Oh, sure. So great question. Thank you, Nancy. It was a really organic process, and one where I think that, at least from my perspective, as someone who had been doing research on issues related to information concealment and revelation at the state level, it's when Allison and I started noticing there's this weird secrecy thing going on in these international organizations. We don't have anything on that in the field, and it feels very different both from our normative priors, that these IOs are supposed to be accountable, transparent institutions, and also our sort of theoretical functional priors of international institutions being information conveyor belts. And so once we found it in that nuclear domain and started to see it in places like peacekeeping, and when we found one, the way in which business confidential information plays a role in trade disputes, not in like one or two trade disputes, but a bunch of them, that was when really the idea took off to do a book. This is a book-worthy kind of idea. And in terms of future work, I think we could both answer your question about things we left aside and didn't pursue, and think about future work in the same way. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting is one that we've already talked about and Keren asked about, which is, so what leads institutions to adopt this kind of institutional form, and what sort of path-dependent processes stop institutions from doing so, and then what kind of disruptive crises or political maneuverings by particular states lead them to adopt them. And that's something we talk about in the book, but we don't make front and center of the story. We're really interested in the consequences of these confidentiality systems, in the flow of information and the degree of which cooperation is achieved. But I think future research that looks at the politics, whether they're domestic, whether they're multilateral, whether they're having to do with the institution itself, and whether it has like a culture of secrecy or a history of transparency or something like that, a bunch of different stories you could tell about why they adopt this kind of form. So I think things like that, and then of course extending it to other issue areas we didn't have a chance to do in the book, is one I'm really hopeful people who actually know what cybersecurity is about versus me, who struggles to get the computer to work, would be able to take this and travel with it to those types of domains.
Great, thank you. Next I have Justin.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Great. So Austin, Allison, I'm sorry, my video is not working right now. I'm so happy to see how this has culminated. This is such a contribution to the field and such an ambitious project. So I had a question about kind of where we go from here. So, it seems to me that a key premise of your book is that there's this idea that states are kind of the keepers of private information. And, these days it seems to me that we're entering kind of a noisier environment. So, even in the old days, we had firms and NGOs who may have had kind of firsthand information that states didn't have and who never have an incentive to withhold. And then now we're seeing kind of this, proliferation of commercial satellites, of GPS, of open source intelligence firms. And then even on the opposite side, the pervasiveness of disinformation and things like that on social media. So it seems to me that there's the total amount of sensitive information out there that states have under their control is actually maybe decreasing. And I'm wondering what the implications of this are for your story and whether this is a good or a bad thing for IOs.
Yeah, thanks so much, Justin. I guess there's a couple parts to your question. So first, I guess I would emphasize that your question deals with, I think, predominantly the security domain, because in the economic domain, firms still do have, control over information about, contract level details like their pricing, sourcing costs, things like that. But in the security realm, you're right, there is more open source information and commercial satellites and everything that you referenced. But then I think that's a separate question too from the misinformation. And there, I actually think the misinformation makes the sort of confidentiality function even more important and relevant, because conclusions from states that are, based on their own sources of information might be even less credible today, because there's so much misinformation. And so IOs can help to sort of focus the international community on specific credible sources and vet the information. But I do think you're right that our story does rely on states as keepers of much of the information, and how relevant that is, I think, also depends on what area of international security you're talking about, and sort of what sources of information you're talking about, right? So like if you think about a human source of information versus a satellite versus, signals or what intercepts or whatever, I think that varies widely. So to the extent that there are more open sources of information, then yes, I think the secrecy would be slightly less needed, but I think that varies a lot.
Yeah, to add to that, I think number one, it is a complicated question whether or not the pool of information that states have that others don't have is actually decreasing, because for every sort of commercialization of satellites, so now states are no longer the only ones who have satellite information, that same technological change or related ones are also creating ways for states to surveil in ways they didn't used to. And so trying to tally that all up is really difficult. But keeping with the premise of the question, Justin, which I really like and think is probably on balance correct, there's two things I wanted to mention. One consequence of that is that you might want to think about ways of how to adapt this process to allow non-state actors to disclose insights they gain that others do not have, to the degree to which that is something that private actors could increasingly do. So you could think about sort of like private cybersecurity firms who might be able to identify whether a cyber attack has happened and who did it. Could we think about outfitting international organizations to receive those disclosures of that information, which might not want to be made public for some reason, but could help feed into a monitoring system of some future IO regarding that area? So it's not that our framework would work the same, because it wouldn't be a state disclosure, but it would be a non-state disclosure in the security domains. The other way to think about this, which I think is really interesting, is we actually learned about a way in which the state-centric process we look at is assisted by the greater degree of open source information. So one thing that we learned that certain governments do, maybe the United States, is provide intelligence to an actor like the IAEA. And then when the IAEA sort of vets that information, decides this is valid insights about, let's say, overhead imagery of a country that might be engaged in proliferation activities, then the IAEA publicly cites and releases and circulates a commercial satellite photo, which may not be at the same level of precision, may not be at the exact day or time that they got the original intelligence of, to help bolster their case. And so there's ways in which you can kind of point to this other kind of information, even though intelligence is helping you do the initial assessment and identification of specific kinds of non-compliant activity. And so there's sometimes ways in which this open source stuff can actually support the system, the process, rather than just be an alternative to it.
Terrific. Now we have Jack Snyder and then Paige Fortner.
So you start off by positioning your argument relative to that of the Bob Cohen generation of IO scholarship. And when I think about that work, I usually think of it in terms of collective action problems being solved by big, inclusive, multilateral schemes, and where the threats to the cooperation come from things like cheating on the system as a whole or free riding on the system. But when I think about both Allison, your Power Plays book, but also this new book, I see a lot of the action being in the context of bilateral relationships and the particular interests of particular states vis-a-vis other states, allies whose toes you don't want to step on, your own private information sources that you don't want to reveal. And so, one question is, do you see this as a conscious move in your research program where you're maybe building on that kind of multilaterally collective action focused tradition of IO work, but either adding a layer or adding some mechanisms that were there all along, but were not the focus of attention?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think I would say that those two, to me anyway, are really related, that I wouldn't draw such a sharp distinction necessarily between cheating bilaterally versus cheating multilaterally, because I think what we're trying to say is if you cheat bilaterally, it affects the whole system, because then other states observe that, that you'll cheat in terms of the relationship with that state, and so it can affect the entire system. And that by focusing on the bilateral relationships sort of collectively, you get these systemic implications. So I guess in that sense, maybe adding a layer, but I think just kind of building upon what was there all along, maybe making it more explicit. Would you agree with that, Austin?
I don't know. It's an interesting point. Thank you, Jack. I think part of this is about your earlier book, Allison, and I see the through line, which is really in the emphasis on the political relationship between two states, right? So either the one you're coercing because of the different trade vulnerabilities they have in your first book, or for us, when you're making these disclosure decisions, at least on the security intelligence side of the book, it being shaped by the degree to which the information is relevant to an ally or to an adversary. And that sort of language and geopolitical logic not being in the original Cohenian spirit of sort of like, here's a common problem, here's an informational reason we can't solve it, and so here's an institution that we create to facilitate that solution. So I think I kind of do buy that that's one move we're making in this book. That's a move that's echoed in Allison's first book. And I think, Jack, the only thing I'd add to it is I just don't think it fully captures what we're trying to do in this book, because I think we're both adding that sort of consideration of sort of bilateral or a small number of states in that disclosure decision. But in terms of this secrecy function that I think the IO is serving in our story, that is, even ignoring the bilateral kind of constraints we build into the theory, that's just, to me, seems different than what Cohen was saying, right? And I always go back, because I was trained at Ohio State. I read stuff, Alex Thompson, who was a Duncan Snyder student. the law merchant model that a lot of this literature was built on was just this sort of like apolitical thing that made merchants in the 16th century know whether or not somebody, reneged on a contract. And that was a very sort of just let's make information more freely available. That's going to make compliance more reliably observed. And there, I think, it's not that we're disagreeing with that. We're just saying there's this like weird secrecy component to that process. So I think it's actually both of those that I think we could point to. But I really like elevating the bilateral side of it.
Great. Paige?
Thanks, Allison and Austin. It's a great talk and a great book. And I'd second what others have said about both the theoretical innovation and also just the really impressive breadth. Any one of the empirical domains that you look at in this book could have been enough to substantiate the book, and the fact that you tackle all four really well is really impressive. My question builds a little bit on Keren's question about trust and the trustworthiness of the institution. And I think it was in your answer, Austin, talking particularly about the extent to which the receivers of the conclusions that the IO disseminates trust the IO. And I'm wondering, this is kind of a, have you seen examples of this kind of question? And also, well, I'll ask it first and then there's another piece of it. I'm wondering whether there are kinds of organizations or specific organizations where the receivers of the information might trust that the organization is unbiased with respect to to adversaries who might have different incentives to share information or to believe information, and that the IO can kind of be impartial with respect to a bilateral or maybe even a multilateral state situation, but that the IO might have some stake in the outcome because of the nature of the IO. So I'm thinking about, if the way the information is, what kind of information is disseminated might lead to freer trade or less free trade. Would the WTO have an incentive to kind of push things one way or the other? Or for the UN, if it's in a peacekeeping realm, some might not want to reveal information that would lead a party to go back to war because that would then lead to peacekeeping failure, or those kinds of things where the organization doesn't have a stake in which state wins, but it has a stake in the outcome itself for its own, in terms of its own mission. So have you seen examples of that? And if there are either specific organizations or types of organizations where that's a problem, do you think that there are ways to overcome that? Do IOs then have to do something more to do the kinds of things that Allison was talking about to build their own trust? Or are those sort of hopeless cases in this sense, that not entirely hopeless, but hopeless in the sense that like the fact that the IO itself has a stake might make receivers of the information more skeptical of that information?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I like it a lot. I'm trying to think. I mean, it's clear that IOs do have their own preferences or stakes in types of outcomes. But where I'm not sure that I can think of an example is when that would influence whether they're able to credibly vet the information, just because the state that's providing the information would know, I think, if the IO is not doing its job properly, because they at least would know the sensitive details. And if the IO is misrepresenting it, that state might A, say something about it, or B, be more reticent to share information in the future. So it seems like there would be consequences for the IO to misrepresent the information itself. But that doesn't mean that when it combines that information with its own information and then releases the conclusions, that's not, sort of in line with the IO's agenda. I'm trying to think of specific examples of that. Austin, do you have any?
I don't know about examples of that. Well, the main reaction to Paige, to your question, which I really love, is I actually think of a different independent preference or interest of IOs that comes to mind that I just want to mention as one that actually I think ends up being supportive of this process. So I think the one thing that we noticed when we did our interviews is that IOs, if they had an independent interest, it was oftentimes in protecting their reputation for sort of technocratic neutrality. And that was sort of like their role in this whole constellation of actors. And so they'd be very protective of that. And there were sometimes concerns that the very receipt of that sensitive information would potentially undermine that, right? Because if they're only getting information from certain kinds of actors, it might undermine that. So one thing we talk about in the book and was really interesting to learn about was steps the international organizations would take to reassure members that, even though we're receiving the sensitive information, we're not being led by the nose and having our neutrality undermined. And that was really where you saw that sort of independent interest of the IO. Now, the independent interest you're pointing to, which is sort of like the IO has a vested interest in cooperation succeeding in the issue area, that they govern. I think the thing I keep thinking about is less an example than more conceptual, which is that I think what you're pointing to or highlighting is that we're looking at sort of universal IOs where the WTO's interest is in free trade globally. It's not free trade in one region. And so what ends up happening then is if the IO has an independent interest in a sort of broadly sort of with something with limited distributional sort of consequences or differences, then I think that independent interest wouldn't necessarily be at odds or create a problem for sort of like making that goal more effective by receiving sensitive information. What would be interesting is if you saw this in a situation of like a regional IO or an IO that was sort of, more like a NATO, like one that actually had a sort of vested geopolitical sort of positionality on an issue. There, I think you would see that IO's interest in furthering cooperation, but cooperation which has a harder edge to it or more distributional consequences, could actually have very interesting consequences that I haven't, I can't off the top of my head think about an example of that, but I really am interested to look into it though. I don't know if that makes sort of response to exactly what you had in mind, but that's what comes to mind.
Thanks. Great. So I think we have time for two more. We have Michael Doyle and then Theo.
Hi, Allison and Austin. A fascinating set of arguments, needless to say. Your broad conclusions resonate very deeply with me. I was the last person that tried to put together something called ISIS, not the ISIS, but the EISAS, which came out of the Brahimi report. And Kofi asked me to try to organize that function and get support for it. And as you probably know, obviously from the record, we manifestly failed. That is, it was pushed aside. One of the many reasons was a set of asymmetric levels of appreciation and fear for what an IO might do. A lot of the small countries were very nervous about that kind of a capacity under the view that it would be captured by the great countries and specifically by the US. Many people, for example, were aware that the US had a very robust intelligence capacity within UN headquarters. When they remodeled the building, they pulled out miles worth of wires that were hard to explain. These were not just electrical conduit wires. And so it was an asymmetric set of concerns about intelligence within the US system. And that applied to the UN. And so my general question, given the fascinating insights that you put on the table, is whether there's any systematic differences in appreciation for intelligence sharing, information provision between small states and large states, or whether it just in other areas, like trade or arms control or health or elsewhere, the effects wash out that are simply different.
Oh, that's a fascinating question and a really interesting point. And I do think that great care needs to be taken to reassure, particularly these small states, that an IO has not been captured, because that's a really real fear. It does happen, right? you alluded to one example. There's also, Austin and I discussed in the book the example of Unstong, which was, captured by the CIA, and it completely eroded trust in the institution. And we can think of others. So I do think there are some things that IOs can do to try to avoid the perception of being captured, assuming they have not been captured, and to try to safeguard against being captured. So one that we talk about is adopting transparency alongside of secrecy. So while IOs can keep the actual content of the sensitive information secret, they could reveal in public-facing documents or other forms a larger set of information. So if you think about, say, the WTO, it can release the panel reports with the information just redacted. So transparency in the reports, but secrecy in the actual information. And similarly with processes by which the IO evaluates information, or where even to the extent that it can without revealing too much, where information is coming from. So can it triangulate between multiple sources of information and not just rely on information from, say, the United States? And the more I think it can be transparent by the set of states it's getting information from, or the range of sources that it's getting information, what it does with that information, and to sort of reassure states that there is no capture going on, I think is helpful. But capture certainly occurs, and that's something definitely to guard against.
So just to add to that, I think there is a short answer, Michael, to this really interesting issue is there does matter which issue area we're talking about. So one thing that came to mind was in the trade domain. Think about these trade disputes. I was really surprised to learn about the kinds of countries who were participating in these disputes and who were submitting business confidential information as part of their case, right? And these are countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, South Korea, Ukraine. And they're, it's not the usual suspect great powers. And so in some ways it depends that in the case of trade, it actually can be a weapon of the weak to use a dispute to try to contest what it would otherwise be a trade barrier that could not be addressed. And to the extent that you can harness firm information to help make your case better, then those weak states actually might support that kind of reform. So that's one example of how the economic domain might be different. The other thing that came to mind was it matters a lot who has control over the organization and who can initiate and approve reforms. So, in the domain you experienced, weak powers were able to undermine it. But one case we look at is these ad hoc international criminal tribunals. And when they reached a point where they could not hold high-level leaders accountable without getting intelligence from Western Europe and the United States, the decision about what evidence would be admissible and how it would be handled and whether or not the other side would get to see it in a courtrooms type setting, that was something that didn't, weak states didn't really have a say over that. That was something that was decided in a much more sort of smaller, set of states. It was functionally a negotiation between the chief prosecutor of the ICTY in the US and its partners. And so there it was sort of like the weak powers were just shut out of the decision. And so I think it can depend on the issue area, but it can also depend on how the institutions reform mechanisms, like how many veto points really weak states might have. That's going to affect whether or not they end up being able to express any problems in the form of blocking reforms.
Great. So we have time for one more question. Theo, you have the last question.
No pressure. Hi, I'm Theo Melanopoulos. I'm a PhD student here at Columbia and in UT Austin for the year. My question is follows up on something Professor Doyle and Professor Fortner was asking. Thinking not necessarily about how the recipients of this information and adjudication might be perceiving the ruling, but how providers might be willing to provide some of this information if they're not necessarily even real bias in the institution, but just perceived bias. And I'm thinking of the United States and the WHO today, right, in terms of coordinating a response to the pandemic. And then my question actually was partially answered by Professor Doyle, which was that do these IOs that become the recipients of secret information then become the targets of espionage?
Yeah, those are great. And I think they do become the targets of espionage. It's kind of, so one thing, to take your second point first, one thing Austin and I want to explore actually further going forward, but haven't yet had the chance to, is this sort of obsolescing, I don't know what to call it, obsolescing intelligence provision, where, just give me 2 minutes, where if the more information you share with an international organization, the greater the incentives for espionage, because now it has all this really interesting information. And so you can get sort of a cycle where the more, where it perpetuates itself. And then on your first one, I do think that perceived bias can be an issue. And one thing that was suggested on a call with one of the experts on the WHO was that, for example, in that organization, its credibility had been so compromised that in order to get states to share information, you would actually have to potentially spin off a whole new section of the organization so that that could kind of like start fresh and overcome the bias in the rest of the organization. So I think levels of bias depend on the organization and the organization's history, and whether or not these can be incorporated well into a given organization sort of depends on a number of factors. But in some cases, you might even just need to sort of show that you're getting a fresh start.
Yeah, Theo, I think that's a great question. Cool set of issues that come up there. One, you're suggesting this idea that the disclosure might have a misperception about bias, which is certainly an interesting direction for future research, not something that we sort of build into our theoretical framework, but one that the WHO and this sort of politicization of it and under the Trump administration and China's role in COVID-19 points to a possibility for future research. It's cool. But I think, bring it full circle, right? Like a lot of these perceptions about the bias or unbiased nature of an IO, these depend a lot depending on who the president of the US is or who the leaders are. And so a transition to a Biden administration, you're going to see something very different. They're going to look at the WHO and probably say, let's rehabilitate, let's re-engage, let's have leadership. And I wouldn't be surprised if that, sharing a more robust, sort of information sharing regime, which included a role for sensitive information, might be part of the things they're looking at to try to make the WHO more credible down the road. And obviously, if Trump had won the re-election, had been reelected, then there'd be a very different story. And so that's something that's going to be interesting to look at in the next 4 years.
Terrific. So this brings us to, we're out of time, unfortunately. There's a lot more to discuss, and that's what tends to happen when you have such a great book, so stimulating. I want to thank Austin and Allison for taking the time to share this wonderful book with us. The link to buying the book is on the chat. I highly recommend it, cannot recommend it highly enough. Thank you very much for being with us. And thank you for a terrific and insightful and engaging conversation. Have a great weekend, everyone, and we will see you in our next event. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.